This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are going to talk about keeping a series exciting and fresh. So how do you keep a story going over the course of a long series without repeating the same plot elements over and over, tiring out characters and readers? And I know you both have ideas on this, so I'm going to turn it over.
I'll let Kathryn go first this time.
All right.
Well, I like this topic because I think it happens to a lot of different authors, right? Where you get a great set of characters or a series going, and then you just want to keep writing in it, right? But like book 9, book 10, book 11, book 13, book 22, now you have the same detective or you have the same, main character. What are they going to encounter that's new, right? How do you keep it exciting to the audience who wants the same feeling, right? They want the same genre, they want the same detectives, whodunit mystery or whatnot, but you don't want to give them the same murder 3 books in a row, or even 3 books out of a 20-book series, right? So I think it's really hard to mix it up when you have a lot of the same elements that you have to weave in, right? So yeah, I'm excited about this one. Sorry, I don't have an answer yet, but there you go.
But you will have an answer.
I will. Well, I have, yeah. It's more like less answer and more like, this is a cool problem to have, right? Your reader wants more. You have a great set of characters. You have an awesome world. You have, whatever genre you want to be writing this in, you have like something the readers have really attached to, and they want book 9 and they want book 10. Right. It's just, where can you continue to find those creative energies? So.
Yeah, and you bring up genre. This question came from one of our YouTube viewers who brought up epic fantasy and having, battle after battle after battle. But I think you mentioned detectives and Arthur Conan Doyle through Sherlock Holmes off of Reichenbach Falls because he was sick of him. So we've got potentially different approaches to this. You've got the arcless protagonist, or even if your protagonist does have an arc to an extent and you let him or her develop, you're within the confines of a genre where you might have episodic stories, each one stands alone, but they're all going to fit that mold. Or you've got the long, like epic fantasy arc where the whole thing creates one coherent storyline. But, that journey is going to repeat certain elements as you go through it. So, I don't know, Robert, do you want to pick up on either of those?
Sure, yeah. Innovation is one part, I think, where there have been plenty of famous writers over the years who have said that story boils down to either 3, 6, or 7, or 9 variations on the same thing. Man falls in a hole, man has to get out of the hole. 2 star-crossed lovers meet. We can box it all down to archetypes. So in a way, yes, you're always going to be repeating something that's familiar. And I liken this to, most people, enjoy eating out. Now, why do we go to different restaurants but perhaps choose the same meal? Why do I go to different Italian places just to have a pizza? Why don't I just go to the one that's just got the pizza that's closest? Because I have a slightly different experience. My expectation is I'm going to get a pizza, but it's going to taste slightly different, or it's going to be cooked slightly differently. So I think we're always going to have typical and maybe even tropey conflicts within some of the more genre-based fiction that are expected. So in a detective story, we're going to expect that there's a crime, and then we're going to expect the detective solves that for the most part. There might be outlier innovations where it doesn't happen, but for the most part, the readership is expecting that. In an epic fantasy series, they might be expecting them. There's going to be some fairly epic battles. If we take Lord of the Rings, there are some major staged battles throughout. But there are also some intensely personal moments. And so I think the ability to take the rising and falling action in a way that surprises the reader but doesn't seem like it's not part of that genre is important. And one way you can do that is to pull in other aspects. So if I go back to my pizza example, you might go and have a pizza, but it's got a Thai style or an Asian topping, right? And so you go, okay, well, it's been innovated. And so I've got, I need to have a battle scene. Because it's my epic fantasy and it's a climax. So, but this time the battle is raging all around, and all of a sudden in the dungeon, the protagonist finds him or herself face to face with one of the main antagonists. And so it's become now intensely personal. How can they outwit each other? But the main battle is still raging around, and that would still satisfy the reader's need to experience the feeling of being in a full-blown battle, but not necessarily seeing it from the general's perspective up on the hill, but right in the action, for example.
I think we should go into more depth on that, Robert. So you've said two things that I wrote down: personal moments and other aspects. And, you know, thinking of like Lord of the Rings, you've got the hobbits, and then you've got the wizards, and then you've got the elves, and then you've got the golem, and then you've got the trolls or whoever, the giants. So it is a journey over a landscape with a long arc and a lot of battles, but we keep seeing new elements, bringing in those other aspects of this world that we've entered. And, you know, if you look at Harry Potter, it's all set in Hogwarts. And so the journey through the world isn't an expansive landscape. They do go to other places, other forays, but the cast of characters keeps growing, and as things get more complex and darker and richer, we have this spiraling effect of like drawing in new characters and new parts to this world, new pieces from Harry's family's past and new pieces of, the Death Eaters, and the threat moves out into the Muggle world and such. And so without creating the epic journey across worlds, we have one world, but we still keep drawing on those other aspects to expand it. So, I know.
That's what I was kind of thinking too, is revelation.
Yeah.
Like if you can bring in, even if you're using a very similar plot line, if it's got a revelation or some sort of new twist on what the character is discovering, especially in series arcs where you want that character to be growing, like they may encounter very similar situations, but based on the revelation in the previous book, handle it completely differently. And that change is going to make the reader excited, right? Oh man, like here comes that enemy again, but now Harry knows ... or now there's a whole different team that's assembled, or now different powers have come to play, so let's see how it turns out this time. Jim Butcher's series that I'm totally blanking on with Tavi, it's a very similar thing where he learns, he grows, revelation happens, teams are built.
Codex Alera.
Thank you. I knew Robert knew it. It's like, it is a very similar thing. There's a battle at the end, climactic battle, but, he's growing, things are changing, the world is changing, so it keeps us involved. So even if it's just like that, you need that evolution arc, you need your character to grow and to have these challenges. Like you can change it based on revelation on the world, revelation to the character, revelation on, the magic system, whatever you need to do.
Right. And I think that dovetails us into the other point Robert made of personal moments, so you might have the same kind of conflict, battle after battle, for instance, but each one will have a different meaning, a different emotional impact on the reader, have a different effect on the protagonist. When Harry Potter is in, I think it's pretty much his first battle of the series, it's the troll in the girls' bathroom, but that's when Harry and Ron befriend Hermione. She's no longer just that annoying girl. Now the three of them kind of become a trio. So then when they go into battle with Professor Quirrell, you've got all three of their talents in teamwork getting Harry up to the final conflict of protagonist versus antagonist. And so, every book in the series has a different type of confrontation that causes Harry's growth or promotes Harry's growth. And some of them in a very negative way, like when Sirius Black is taken out of the series, right? Or when Cedric Diggory dies. And so it's not always positive, but the effect is personal, deeply emotional for the reader as well as the protagonist, and causes growth, not only an escalation of plot stakes, but real growth in the character of the protagonist that creates development for the next conflict to come.
Mm-hmm.
This is one, I agree completely that it's same but different, basically, is what you're trying to do, but same but different, but rising.
Yes.
And illustrating and showing the change of the characters throughout as well, where that's appropriate in the big arc type series. Maybe a little different in the detective or the Jack Reacher series, where you have a more flat character arc,
right.
But it's still same thing. You're trying to do same but different. This is one where I really do go back to. I really like Sean Coyne's story grid approach of the idea of progressive complications. So it's not just a complication, it's a progressive complication. And one of the things you see new writers stumbling over is they either repeat the same complication. So, the person, I don't know, they're out skiing and they break their leg, and that causes some issues for them. And then a few chapters later, they trip over in the kitchen, they break their arm. It's the same thing. Right, so it doesn't make any sense. You've got to somehow make them progressive, or show that there's a greater fallout. Because sometimes you can repeat a scene, and you do it because you're echoing an earlier scene, but this time it's showing something different. So the breaking a bone isn't necessarily an absolute rule. But what I'm saying is, if you do it to establish the same type of complication, it gets boring to the reader, and they don't really know why. So I like the idea of making it progressive, so that things progressively get either harder and harder to solve, or worse and worse and worse for the protagonist, or sometimes the complication can be better. All of a sudden they find themselves bestowed with power that they don't know how to use. And so I think that's a way to look at, yes, you might need to have battle after battle after battle, but you've got to progressively complicate those. And
right.
the Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece in that.
Right. And besides escalating the stakes or progressively complicating the conflict, it's not just he broke his foot and he walks with a cane and now he broke his leg and he's in a wheelchair. It's not that kind. You also need a variety. So what are the emotional wounds, or what is the psychological damage, or what, right? So it's not always the same sort of effect on your protagonist. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's right. And then mix it up and make it appropriate to where you're at in that particular book, where you're at in that series arc, what this is going to mean for the next step. So if you create, a climax in a book, it might be dramatic and exciting, but if you don't know how that is going to factor into the next book, into the next stage of the series arc or the character's arc, stop, go back, think ahead before you craft that development, because everything is going to ripple out, everything is going to affect whatever comes next. So maybe you'll find, that conflict should go later in the series arc because the effect I can create with it is so excellent. It's such a big escalation, or maybe it needs to go backwards because it's not a big enough impact for where I'm at in the series.
Right. So what we've been talking about is like those series is that really you're developing from the beginning as the series arc, right? So take the time to figure it out beforehand. Like J.K. Rowling famously, she knew all 7 books, right? She knew where she was headed. She knew where she wanted to progressively build it. I'm sure Lord of the Rings was the same because Tolkien is insane. But like those are best case scenarios, right? You knew that you were going to do a very long story. So therefore you progressively complicated it well, you ramped it up, you built it up, book after book. What about the ones that, well, I've written 4 books and people want more, right? How do you then continue it maybe in a way where you don't want it to ramp up, or you don't necessarily have an end goal or a series arc? Like, how do you do that?
Well, okay, first I want to say that Rowling said, I think I read this on the Wikipedia page or something, so I haven't fact checked, but she said that when she was writing book 4, she found a huge hole in her plot that she had to fix during the writing process. So yes, she had a 7-book series arc and she knew where she was heading and she had done a ton of development, but there is still room to surprise yourself, and there's still room for development and creativity and all kinds of stuff to happen while you're writing your book, lest we give the impression that there are certain masterminds who just...
or that you must have all 13 books planned before you endeavor to do a 13-book series. Right.
Well, I think with what you said, Kathryn, it's you set a goal of X, maybe it's 5 books, maybe it's 9 books, and you give yourself a series arc that is very specific for the first 3 books, and gets more and more broad, or broader and broader as you get out there. So by the time you're on book 3, you've got a really good sense of, book 4 is pretty much set, and 5 and 6 are solidifying. You always need to be ahead of yourself, because whatever you establish, you can't undo it once it's published, and you certainly don't want to go rewrite every thing that came before if you can avoid it. So I think it's just a matter of staying ahead of yourself far enough that you don't create problems, logistical problems. Right.
Yeah, and no character is ever fully formed, I suppose. So one of the things, to Kathryn's point about, I've written 4 books and I kind of don't know where to go with it. You could literally put 2 things together and say, okay, where's the character's dark side? And what chaotic event could happen that would throw them off? Can I make something from that? Because, and I've come across the same things where, and especially when I was inexperienced, and I thought that the increasing the stakes was all external. And so, well, by the time you save the universe, what's left to save? And if you all you're going to be doing is repeating the same thing again, because there's going to be a new villain come on. But hang on a minute, I've already saved the universe once. You may have to do it again. And so it's tough, I think, if you've written yourself into that kind of corner. But one way to do that, to get out of that corner, is to come back into internal stories. Throw the character into a challenge they've never had before. Innovate on a different premise that you've read in another book, for example. So if it's not necessarily an arc-based series, but one where it's, say, family sagas, for example, they can be tricky to maintain. But people love the characters so much they want to keep going with them. You think, but they've already killed everybody off, or married everyone off, or had all their babies. Now, what do I do?
The next generation.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So there's a way to pick up a thread somewhere, and one way to do it is to look internally in the character. What is it they don't know about themselves yet, and what chaotic event would throw that into play? Right.
That's great, Robert. And in addition to looking inside your protagonist and saying, where else can I go with that character, you could look at your supporting characters. As you were talking, I thought of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where, it's a 7-season series, and each season has a different kind of mega antagonist, right? And I don't know what year it was, but along came Dark Willow. So now you've got a season antagonist who's one of our primary supporting characters. So what is our hero going to do when the person she has to take down is somebody she loves as her best friend, right? So our hero and her posse, how are they going to solve this problem, and can they do it without killing Willow? Can they get Willow back instead of just defeating her the way they have every other antagonist? So, you know, I guess that's kind of a combination of what you were saying, looking inside your protagonist, how can I create chaos, right? Like, what is Buffy going to do if she loves the villain? And also looking externally, like, what new element can I pull in? What are my supporting characters' roles? You know, how can I play with what already exists in this world?
Yeah. And that's, you just triggered something for me as well, because we sort of came across this from that question about keeping a series exciting as an antagonist grows in dark power across the series. So there may not be necessarily that much of an antagonist at the start. There may even be within the hero's circle, like you've just mentioned with Buffy there, and then they become an antagonist that you either may want to dispose of or bring back into the circle in some way, shape or form. And I think one way to think about that is, what is as the antagonist grows in stature behind the scenes, perhaps over that series, what this person was thinking, well, how do I keep that going and just do battle after battle after battle? It just seems boring. One way to look at that is, what does that antagonist play out in? So in Harry Potter's a perfect example, really, because you've got Voldemort playing out in all these different antagonists, sub-antagonists, if you like, that come into play that Harry has to confront. They become his training hurdles, you know, that he has to overcome all these things like levels in a game. So I think in this particular person asking this question, they've clearly got a handle on where their entire series is going, which is wonderful. But they're worried about just repeating the same battle against this antagonist over and over and over, and the answer to that is to personify the antagonist into episodic characters, or throw someone in. You know, we don't all live our lives with the same friends we started out in you know, primary school, for example. You know, things change, people come into our lives, some for good, some not for good, and you know, why wouldn't an epic story mirror the same experience? Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, Harry, I was thinking of the same example, and then you beat me to it.
We'll always come back to...
I know, the H word.
Even we talked about Jim Butcher. Codex Alera is a good example of that. Same thing. An overriding, pretty much, antagonist. And again, to reference Jim Butcher, the Dresden series, I mean, he had apparently a pretty good idea of what his overarching storyline still is to be. It hasn't played out completely yet, but you know, I think we're waiting for, what are we waiting for? Book 17 or 18 or something? I can't remember now. But apparently it's all going to end in the next 3 books. But you know, there's new characters come into play, and they seem quite feasible. You just you know, you don't question it. Oh, where did this come from? No, it seems like it's reasonable that in part of that world there would be this person. And so I think, you know, if you've got that epic a setting with a big antagonist that rises through in power across the end, you're going to have other villains in there that become a part of that antagonist world, that interfere and poke in, and there's
the minions.
I think it's, exactly.
So use minions.
Use minions, and we might think that they are the big baddie at the time, like you do in Harry Potter, or like you do in the Dresden series, but you find out that it's not done yet. You know, and that's your open loop at the end of the book.
And the other thing to do is to make the conflicts appropriate to the protagonist's ability level at each stage of the series. You know, so Luke Skywalker does not duel Darth Vader in the first movie, even though we meet Darth Vader in the prologue when he kidnaps Princess Leia. So the big bad is established immediately, but we save the protagonist-antagonist face-to-face combat until later in the series when Luke is ready for it. You know,
that's right. I go back to Hero's Journey. You know, they can only do that when they're ready to express their gift. And you know, for the most part, the entire story is about Luke acquiring his gift.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and going back to Harry Potter, But
why not?
You can use a similar kind of idea where she like changed the way that the plot. It's always against Voldemort, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're always going to battle Voldemort in the end. But the first book is kind of like, let's figure out how to protect the Sorcerer's Stone. Nobody's listening to us. The second book's a monster story. The third book is, like it's got all this outside pressure from the Dementors. The fourth book's a puzzle story because they're solving the maze. And, so you can, even though it's all about the ultimate battle with Voldemort, she changes the direction that the plot works, right? So it does. It's not necessarily we're gearing up for battle. It's we're solving these little puzzles that are going to lead Harry through the maze, and ultimately is actually going to be what helps him solve the puzzle and saves his life, right? So,
right,
Yeah.
right, and also having Ron and Hermione there as sidekicks gives Harry resources that he doesn't necessarily possess himself, or at least not to the same extent as his best friends. So by always having the three of them together, you've always got Hermione's book smarts, you've always got Ron's cultural knowledge of the wizarding community and, supportive best friend attitude, and right. And then you've got Harry as growing into his power and ability as a leader and as, the one V1. But that lets you mix up the kind of conflict he's going to face, the kinds of challenges he needs to enter into, because he's got more than one set of skills at his disposal,
And we could just say, well, every book is about Harry battling dark magic and overcoming it. So
right.
It's the same thing repeated over and over and over, but she's innovated in how that's been delivered, which is what you're so brilliantly pointing out, that it's just a surprising way of it playing through that becomes interesting because it also develops Harry and helps us as a reader understand that he's leading up to this battle with somebody who is so contriving and so manipulative that he's managed to orchestrate all these other mini plays of dark magic that Harry has to face. And it's clever, but that's why she's one of the more successful authors of our time. So you can be having your jaw drop on these things, and rightfully so, really. Not every series is like that, but you don't have to. You can aspire to be like that, but you shouldn't let that put you off, that somebody appears to have had all those cogs so beautifully placed together. As you pointed out, she already knew that she had a plot hole anyway at some point. We're all going to face that.
Yeah. Well, I think looking at those books, you can do your own study, looking at them and saying, okay, how did she get all these moving parts and keep them working together? How did she keep a reader's interest? How did she vary Harry versus Voldemort deftly for 7 books through conflict after conflict,
without making it samey?
Right. Right. So, Kathryn, I know you just reread these books. Did they stand the test of time? Are they as good as they were 20 years ago?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes, they were. And honestly, reading them as a writer, because it has been a long time since I have read them, it is even more exciting because you get to see all of the different things. So I highly recommend a reread if it's been a while for you, because we do. I mean, it's a good example of a lot of things. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.